A man who gives away his last horse is either a fool or someone the world hasn't caught up to yet. The wind carried dust low across the valley that morning, thin as smoke, curling around the broken fence posts outside Ethan Cole's land like it already knew the place was slipping away from him. And if you had stood there at sunrise, boots planted in that dry, cracking earth, you would have seen a man with nothing left to lose walking a road no one walks without a horse. Not out here. Not for miles that stretch longer than hope itself. And yet Ethan kept moving, slow, steady, like each step had already been decided long before the sun came up, like whatever he'd given up the night before mattered more than survival. And that's what people couldn't understand. Not then, not yet. 12 hours earlier, he still had it. The last horse, a chestnut with a scar along its flank and eyes that followed him like it knew every mile they'd survived together. Through drought seasons and lean winters, through days when the sky burned white and nights when the cold bit through bone. That horse wasn't just an animal. It was his way out, his way forward, his last piece of something resembling a future. And when a man loses everything else, that's the one thing he holds on to, not for pride, but for breathing room in a world that doesn't offer much of it. The sun had been dropping low when the stranger appeared, just beyond the fence line, not riding, not walking with purpose, just there, like he'd come from somewhere that didn't expect him to make it much farther, his steps uneven, his shoulders carrying a weight that wasn't just physical, and Ethan saw it before he heard anything. The way the man paused like the land itself might refuse him passage. The way his eyes stayed sharp even when the rest of him seemed ready to give out. Apache, that. Much was clear, and in this valley, that meant something, not always spoken out loud, but always understood in the spaces between words. From the road behind him, a voice had called out, one of the townsmen riding past, hat low, tone casual but firm. Don't get involved, Cole. That's not your business. And that's how it worked out here. People drew their lines early and didn't cross them. Not for strangers, not for trouble, not for something that didn't promise a return, and Ethan stood there with the reins in his hand, feeling the leather warm from the day's heat, feeling the quiet weight of that choice settle into his chest. Because once you give something like that away, you don't get it back, not the horse, not what it stands for, and he knew it, every inch of him knew it. The stranger didn't ask, didn't beg, didn't reach out. He just stood there, breathing slow, like he'd already made peace with whatever came next. And there's something about a man who doesn't ask that changes the air around him, something that makes the decision heavier, not lighter. Ethan stepped closer, boots pressing into the dust, the kind that rises just enough to remind you how dry the world's gotten. And he studied the man for a second longer than necessary, like he was trying to see past the moment into whatever came after. Then, without another word, he slipped the reins free, placed them into the stranger's hand, and said it simple, like it didn't carry the weight it did. Ride. The horse shifted once, sensing the change, but didn't resist, and the Apache man hesitated, just a fraction of a second, long enough to look Ethan in the eye, not with gratitude, not exactly, but with something steadier, something that didn't need translation, and from inside his worn shirt, he pulled out a small piece of turquoise wrapped in leather, pressed it into Ethan's palm, then mounted and turned toward the fading light, disappearing over the ridge like he'd never been there at all. By the time the stars came out, Ethan had nothing left but the land beneath his feet and whatever that small object meant. And when morning came, the valley wasn't as quiet as it used to be. By the time the first light settled over the valley, Ethan Cole could feel it in the ground before he ever saw it. A faint tremor under his boots like something distant was moving, not fast, not rushed, just steady, deliberate. And he stopped walking without meaning to, his body reacting to a rhythm his mind had not caught up with yet, the kind of stillness a man learns when the land starts speaking in ways words cannot carry. The road stretched empty in front of him, pale and cracked, winding through miles of open dust and dry grass that whispered low under the morning wind. And for a moment it felt like nothing had changed, like the world had simply decided to keep going without him, same as always. But then he heard it. Not loud, not sharp, just a distant roll, like thunder too measured to belong to a storm. He turned slowly, eyes narrowing against the rising sun, and at first there was nothing, just a line on the horizon where the earth met the sky. But then the dust began to lift, thin at the edges, building from the center outward, not scattered like wandering riders, but gathered, unified, moving as one. Back in town, men had started stepping out onto their porches, drawn by the same sound, boots on wood, hands shielding their eyes as they looked toward the open land, and no one spoke at first because no one wanted to be wrong about what they were seeing. But the longer they stared, the clearer it became. This was not one man riding hard, not a pair of travelers cutting across the valley. This was something else entirely. Ethan stayed where he was, the small piece of turquoise still resting in his palm, his fingers curling around it like it might explain what was coming if he held it tight enough. And he thought about the night before, about the way the stranger had looked at him without asking, without pleading, and how that silence had felt heavier than any words could have been. And for the first time since dawn, doubt found its way in, quiet, steady, asking a question he had not let himself consider. What if? It had not been enough. The wind shifted, carrying with it the faint scent of leather and dust, and now the shapes were clearer, riders, dozens of them. No, more than dozens, lines forming behind lines, stretching farther back than he could count. And they did not break formation, did not scatter. They moved like they belonged to something larger than any single man, something organized, something intentional. In town, a voice finally broke the silence, low and uncertain, saying what everyone else had been thinking but had not dared to speak. That is no ordinary ride. Another man answered, quieter still, that is not for trade. The words hung in the air, not as a statement, but as a realization settling in too late to change anything. Ethan exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that carries acceptance more than fear, and he stepped off the road, not to run, not to hide, but to stand where he could see them clearly, where whatever was coming would meet him without distance between them. And the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows behind him that stretched toward the approaching riders like the past reaching out one last time. The ground tremor grew stronger now, not violent, but undeniable, a rhythm that matched the beat of something vast and coordinated, and the dust cloud rose higher, catching the morning light until it looked almost golden at the edges, beautiful in a way that did not promise comfort. At the front of that movement, one figure began to separate from the rest, not by speed, but by presence, riding slightly ahead, posture straight, gaze fixed forward, and even from a distance, Ethan knew, not from recognition of the face, but from the way the man carried himself. This was no longer the stranger who had stood at his fence line the night before. This was someone returned to where he belonged, someone whose place in that formation had always been waiting for him. Ethan's grip tightened around the turquoise, and for a brief moment, he considered what the town would say, what they would assume, what lines they would draw to explain what they were about to witness. But none of that mattered now, because whatever was coming across that valley had already been decided the moment he let go of those reins. And there are choices a man makes that do not ask for permission from the world. They simply wait for the world to answer back. And as the riders drew closer, filling the horizon with quiet, unstoppable motion, Ethan Cole stood alone in the open land, with nothing left to offer but the truth of what he had done, and the valley was finally ready to respond. The riders did not slow as they crossed the first mile of open land, and that was the first thing everyone noticed. Not their number, not their formation, but the certainty in their pace, the kind of movement that does not question where it is going or why. And as they drew closer, the details began to take shape, the glint of sunlight along leather reins, the steady rise and fall of horses that had traveled far but did not show it, and above all, the silence. Not a single shout, not a single command carried across the wind, just the sound of hooves striking earth in a rhythm that felt older than the valley itself. Ethan Cole stood where he had chosen to stand, just off the road, boots planted in dry soil that shifted slightly beneath him with each passing second, and he did not reach for anything, did not move to shield himself or step back. Because there are moments when a man understands that whatever comes next has already been set in motion long before he had the chance to prepare for it, and all that remains is to meet it as he is. The figure at the front of the riders came into clearer view now, the same man who had taken the horse, but no longer worn down by distance or fatigue, his posture straight, his shoulders carrying something that looked less like burden and more like responsibility, and the space around him seemed to shift as he moved, not from force, but from recognition. The kind that comes when a man returns to where he belongs, and everything else falls into place around him. Back in town, more people had gathered along the edge of the main street, drawn by the sound and the sight, some standing still, others stepping forward a few inches at a time, as if distance alone might protect them from whatever meaning this moment carried. And among them were the same men who had spoken the day before, the ones who had told Ethan to walk away, their voices quiet now, their earlier certainty replaced by something less comfortable, something that did not fit as easily into the lines they had drawn. The riders began to spread slightly as they approached the open stretch of land where Ethan waited, not breaking formation, but widening just enough to reveal the scale of what had come, lines behind lines, more than any one man could count without losing track, and still they did not rush, did not press forward with urgency. They simply arrived, like a tide that had taken its time reaching the shore. Ethan could feel the weight of their presence before they fully surrounded the space, not closing in, not threatening, just there, a quiet pressure that settled into the air and made everything else seem smaller, and he became aware of the turquoise in his hand again, the edges worn smooth, the leather binding tight, something that had traveled through hands before his and would likely travel through others after, and for the first time, he wondered if it had ever belonged to the man who gave it to him, or if it had always been meant to pass from one life to another at the exact moment it was needed. The lead rider slowed first, drawing his horse to a stop a few yards in front of Ethan, close enough that the details were no longer blurred by distance, close enough that the memory of the night before settled into place without effort, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, the kind of silence that does not come from uncertainty, but from understanding that words would only make something simple more complicated than it needed to be. The man's eyes moved briefly to Ethan's empty hands, to the absence of reins, to the lack of anything that might suggest he had held back even a piece of what he had given, and something in that glance shifted, not outwardly, not in a way the town could easily name, but in a way that carried meaning just the same. Behind him, the riders came to a full stop, one by one, the movement flowing through them without command, like a shared instinct rather than an order, and the valley, which had once felt wide and empty, now held something else entirely, something that had been set into motion by a single decision made without witness or expectation. Ethan lifted his gaze slightly, meeting the man's eyes without challenge, without apology, just steady, the same way he had stood the night before when the choice had been his alone, and the wind moved between them again, softer now, carrying with it the faint scent of distance traveled and something quieter beneath it, something that did not belong to either man alone but to the moment they now shared. And as the sun climbed higher, casting light across faces both familiar and new, it became clear to everyone watching that whatever had brought this valley to Ethan Cole's doorstep was not about what he had lost, but about something far greater that he had chosen to give without ever asking what it might bring back. The man in front did not reach for the reins he once held, did not speak the way most men would after crossing miles to stand face to face again. He simply studied Ethan Cole for a long second that felt longer than the ride itself, as if measuring something that could not be seen with the eye alone. And then, slowly, he inclined his head, not deep, not dramatic, just enough to be noticed by those who understood what such a gesture meant and missed entirely by those who did not. The movement rippled behind him in a way that could not be mistaken for coincidence, one rider after another shifting slightly in their saddles, not lowering themselves, not bowing as a performance, but acknowledging something that had already been decided among them long before they reached this place. And the town, watching from a distance, felt that shift without understanding it, like hearing a word in a language they had never taken the time to learn. Ethan did not move to accept or return the gesture. He simply stood as he had stood before, hands empty, shoulders steady, because whatever this moment was, it was not a trade, not a transaction waiting to be balanced, and the man before him seemed to recognize that too. Without breaking eye contact, the rider turned slightly and lifted his hand, not high, not commanding, just enough for those behind him to see, and the effect was immediate, a quiet unraveling of the formation as a handful of riders moved forward from the lines, guiding their horses with the same measured calm that had carried them across the valley, each one stopping several feet behind their leader, forming a second line that did not press forward but held its place with intention. One of them stepped down from his horse, boots touching the ground with a soft thud that barely disturbed the dust, and he carried something in both hands, wrapped in worn cloth, held not like cargo, but like something that carried weight beyond its size. And as he approached, the air seemed to narrow around the movement, drawing the eye of every person watching, even those who did not yet realize why it mattered. He stopped a few paces from Ethan and did not speak, did not offer explanation. He simply lowered the bundle slightly, enough for Ethan to see what rested inside. Leather, familiar, shaped by use and time, and for a brief moment, the world seemed to fold in on itself, because there it was, the saddle he had removed the night before, the one he had set aside when he let the horse go, returned now without demand, without condition, as if it had never truly left his life at all. The man holding it did not push it forward, did not insist. He waited, just as the stranger had waited the night before, allowing the choice to remain where it had always been, with Ethan, and the silence stretched again, not uncomfortable, not uncertain, but full of something that did not need to be named to be understood. Ethan looked down at the saddle, then back up at the rider who had brought it, and for the first time since dawn, something shifted in his expression, not surprise, not relief, but recognition, the kind that comes when a man realizes that what he gave was seen exactly for what it was, nothing more, nothing less. Behind them, the rest of the riders remained still, their presence filling the valley in a way that no single voice ever could. And even the town, standing at its edge, felt the difference now, the absence of threat, the absence of demand, replaced by something quieter, something that did not fit into the stories they had told themselves about men like these. The lead rider turned his attention back to Ethan and finally spoke, his voice calm, measured, carrying just enough to be heard without needing to rise above the wind. You walked. It was not a question, not an accusation, just a statement of fact, but it carried with it the weight of every mile Ethan had taken without complaint, without witness, and Ethan answered the same way he had given the horse. Without decoration, without explanation, it was yours to ride. The words settled between them, simple, direct, and for a moment, nothing else moved. Not the riders, not the town, not even the wind, as if the valley itself had paused to listen to something it had not heard in a long time, a truth that did not need to be argued or defended, only acknowledged, and in that stillness, it became clear that whatever had begun the night before had not yet reached its end. It had only just begun to show what it truly meant. The saddle did not move until Ethan did, and that was the second thing the valley began to understand. This was not a gift being returned, not a debt being settled in the way men usually counted things, because nothing here was being forced into his hands. It was being placed within reach and left there, waiting, the same way he had left that horse within reach of a stranger who did not ask for it. And now the weight of that choice circled back, not heavier, not lighter, just clearer. Ethan stepped forward, slow, measured, boots pressing into the dust that had not yet settled from the rider's arrival. And he reached out, not for the leather first, but for the space between himself and the man holding it, as if acknowledging that what stood there mattered just as much as what was being offered. And only then did his fingers close around the edge of the saddle, familiar, worn smooth in places only time could shape, carrying the memory of every mile it had known, and for a brief moment, he simply held it, not lifting it, not claiming it, just feeling the truth of it in his hands. The man who had brought it released his grip without hesitation, stepping back into line as if the act itself was complete the moment the choice had been made, and behind him, another rider moved forward, then another, not in a rush, not crowding the space, but one at a time, each carrying something small, deliberate, objects that did not shine with wealth or draw the eye with excess, but carried purpose in the way they were held, tools, supplies, things a man builds a life with when the land offers little and expects much. Ethan watched as they were set down near him, one by one, not stacked, not arranged for display, just placed within reach, each piece adding quietly to something that had been missing long before the night. He gave the horse away, and still, no one spoke of it. No one explained, because explanation would have made it smaller than what it was. In town, the people had drawn closer without realizing it, step by step, pulled by something they could not name. Their earlier caution replaced by a silence that held more attention than fear, and among them were the same men who had measured everything in terms of cost and return, who had believed that what a man gave away was lost forever, and now they stood watching something that did not fit that understanding, something that refused to be counted the way they had always counted things. The lead rider remained where he was, his gaze steady, not overseeing the exchange like a man directing labor, but witnessing it, as if what mattered was not the items themselves, but the act unfolding in front of him. And when Ethan finally lifted the saddle fully into his arms, adjusting it against his side with the ease of someone who had done it 1,000 times before, the rider's eyes shifted slightly, not with approval, not with satisfaction, but with something closer to acknowledgement, the kind that does not need to be spoken aloud to be understood. The wind moved again, softer now, carrying less dust, as if the land itself had settled into a different rhythm, and Ethan became aware of something else, not in what was being given, but in what was not. No one had returned the horse, no one had led it back to him or offered it as part of what lay at his feet, and for a moment, that absence stood out more than anything else, not as a loss, but as a question left unanswered. He glanced up, meeting the rider's eyes again, and though neither man spoke, the meaning passed between them just the same. Some things are not returned because they were never meant to come back the same way they left. Behind them, the riders who had come forward stepped back into their places, and the formation began to settle again, not breaking, not dissolving, but shifting into something new. Something that no longer looked like an arrival, but something closer to a beginning, and the valley, watching from its edge, felt it without fully understanding that what had crossed that open land was not here to take, not here to claim, but to answer something that had been set into motion by a single choice made in silence. And now that answer was taking shape, not in words, not in demands, but in the quiet, steady act of giving back in a way that could not be measured, only witnessed. What remained unsaid carried more weight than everything already given, and Ethan felt it the moment the last rider stepped back into place, the quiet shift in the air that told him this was not finished, not yet, because the valley had not ridden this far just to return what he had lost. They had come for something else, something that did not sit in the dust at his feet. The lead rider studied him again, not as a stranger now, but as a man measuring another man by a standard that had nothing to do with land or money or the things towns built their rules around. And slowly, he turned in the saddle and looked past Ethan, toward the stretch of broken fence, the sagging roof of the small ranch house, the land that had been holding on by little more than stubborn will. That look did not linger, it did not judge, it simply observed. And then he spoke again, his voice steady, carrying across the space without force. This land, it still stands. Ethan followed his gaze without thinking, eyes settling on the same worn edges he had known for years, every crack, every weak post, every place where time had taken more than he could give back, and he answered simply, for now. The words were honest, nothing more, nothing less, and something in that honesty seemed to matter, because the rider nodded once, a small movement, but one that seemed to settle something deeper than the conversation itself. Behind him, another motion began, quieter than before, but no less deliberate, as a group of riders broke away from the formation, not toward Ethan this time, but toward the land itself, guiding their horses along the fence line, dismounting without rush, hands already moving with purpose. Not asking permission, not waiting for instruction, just stepping into the work as if it had already been agreed upon long before they arrived. Ethan watched it happen, the first man lifting a fallen post back into place, another tightening wire that had long since given up holding tension, movements efficient, practiced, not unfamiliar with the kind of labor that keeps land alive when it would rather fall apart. And for a moment, he did not move, did not speak, because there was something about seeing it begin without him that caught him off guard more than anything else that morning. In town, the people had stopped whispering altogether now, their attention pulled fully toward the ranch, toward the unexpected rhythm of work replacing the stillness they had braced themselves for. And one of the men who had warned Ethan the day before stepped forward unconsciously, boots leaving the safety of the porch, as if drawn by something he could not explain, something that challenged the certainty he had carried so easily just hours before. Ethan shifted his grip on the saddle, then set it down slowly, deliberately, not casting it aside, but placing it where it belonged, near the tools that had been returned to him. And without a word, he stepped forward, closing the distance between himself and the first broken section of fence. He reached for the wire, hands finding the familiar tension, the memory of work settling back into his muscles as naturally as breathing. And for the first time since dawn, he was no longer standing still. He was part of it, not leading, not being led, just working alongside men who had crossed miles to stand where he stood now. The lead rider watched this without interruption, his gaze steady, not overseeing, not directing, simply witnessing the moment a man chose to step back into his own life without being asked. And there was something in that choice that carried more meaning than any words that could have been spoken. The wind moved again, lighter now, carrying the sound of hands at work, of wood settling into place, of something being restored not by force, but by presence, by intention, and Ethan did not look back toward the town, did not check who was watching or what they might think, because that no longer held weight in the way it once had. What mattered was here, in the dust, in the sunlight, and the quiet rhythm of people who had chosen to answer something they had recognized in him. And as the valley continued to shift around that small piece of land, it became clear that what had begun as a single act of giving had turned into something far larger, something that did not end with what was returned, but with what was rebuilt, one post, one step, one silent understanding at a time. By midday, the rhythm of work had settled into something steady and unspoken, the kind of rhythm that does not need direction because every hand already understands what is needed before the thought is finished, and Ethan found himself moving through it without hesitation, passing wire, lifting posts, tightening knots that had once been his burden alone, now shared without a word of agreement, without a single request made. The sun climbed higher, pressing heat down across the land in a way that would have slowed most men, but not these, not today, because what drove them was not urgency, but purpose, and purpose does not tire the same way the body does. Along the fence line, sections that had leaned for months were standing straight again, would set firm into dry ground that seemed to accept it more easily this time, as if the land itself recognized the difference between struggle and support. Ethan paused once, just for a moment, wiping dust from his hands, his gaze drifting across the spread of movement that now filled his property, and it struck him how quiet it all remained. No shouting, no orders, no wasted motion, only the soft sounds of work, leather creaking, wood settling, boots shifting against dirt, and beneath it all, that same steady presence that had arrived with the riders and had not once wavered. He turned slightly and saw the lead rider still mounted, watching not with authority, but with patience, like a man who had already seen how this would unfold and did not need to interfere with what had already begun. Their eyes met again, just briefly, and in that glance there was no distance left between. Stranger and stranger, only recognition, not of names or pasts, but of something simpler, something older, the understanding that a man's actions speak long before his words ever do. Near the edge of the property, a small group of townsfolk had stepped closer than before, not crossing into the work, not interrupting, but no longer holding themselves apart as they had at sunrise, and among them was the same man who had warned Ethan the day before, his hat now in his hands, his posture uncertain, as if the ground beneath his certainty had shifted without asking permission. He watched the work unfold with a quiet that carried more weight than any apology he might have offered, and for the first time, he did not look at Ethan as someone who had made a mistake, but as someone who had done something he himself had not understood how to do. Ethan noticed him, but did not call out, did not signal, because there was no need to draw lines anymore. Not here, not now. The moment had already done that on its own. A few yards away, one of the riders adjusted a section of fencing, testing the tension with careful hands, then stepped back, nodding once to no one in particular, as if confirming that what needed to be done had been done right, and then moved on without waiting for acknowledgement. That was how it continued, piece by piece, no one staying in one place too long, no one claiming ownership over any part of it, the work belonging to the moment rather than to the men themselves. The land began to change in ways that could be seen and felt at the same time, not transformed all at once, but restored in quiet increments. each small act building on the last until the whole carried a different weight, a different meaning than it had before the riders arrived. Ethan picked up a length of wire and moved toward another broken section, hands steady, movement sure, and for the first time in a long while, there was no calculation behind what he did, no weighing of cost against outcome, just the simple act of doing what needed to be done, alongside others who had chosen to be there without being asked. The wind shifted again, carrying the faint sound of hooves from the valley floor, not approaching this time, but moving outward, as if something had been completed and was now beginning to return to where it came from. And Ethan realized that not all of them would stay, not all of them needed to, because what they had come to do was already taking root in the ground beneath his feet. He looked down at his hands, at the dust and the wear, then back across the land that no longer felt as empty as it had the night before, and without thinking, he reached into his pocket, fingers brushing against the small piece of turquoise, still there, still warm from being held. And he understood now that it had never been about the horse alone. It had been about what a man was willing to give when no one was watching, and what the world might return when it finally decided to answer. The sun had begun its slow descent by the time the last section of fence was set firm into the ground, casting long shadows that stretched across the land like quiet proof that something had changed, not in a sudden way, not in a way that demanded attention, but in the kind of way that settles deep and stays long after the moment has passed. And Ethan Cole stood still for the first time since the work had begun, his hands resting at his sides, his breath steady, as he looked out over ground that no longer felt like it was slipping away from him. The riders moved differently now, no longer forming lines or holding position, but shifting in small groups, some returning to their horses, others taking a final look at what had been done, not inspecting, not judging, just acknowledging, and one by one, they began to mount again, movements quiet, unhurried, as if they had already decided that their part here was complete. The lead rider remained where he was a moment longer, his horse still, his gaze resting on Ethan not with distance, but with something closer to closure, and then he guided the horse forward a few steps, closing the space between them once more, not as he had when he arrived, but differently now, the tension gone, replaced by something steadier. Ethan reached into his pocket without thinking, fingers closing around the turquoise, and when he brought it out, he did not hold it tightly this time. He simply let it rest in his open palm, the light catching its worn surface, revealing details he had not noticed before, markings that spoke of time and meaning beyond what he understood, and for a moment, he considered offering it back, completing something that felt unfinished, but the rider shook his head once, a small motion, almost invisible if you were not watching for it. It found its place, he said quietly, his voice carrying just enough to reach Ethan alone, and there was no instruction in it, no expectation, only a statement that settled into the space between them as easily as the silence had before. Ethan closed his fingers around it again, slower this time, understanding that not everything given is meant to return, and not everything kept is meant to be owned. The rider nodded once more, then turned his horse, not sharply, not with finality, just enough to begin the motion that had already started behind him, and as he did, the rest followed, not in command, but in agreement, the valley shifting once more, this time not toward Ethan, but away, lines forming again, dust rising softly under hooves that had carried purpose here and would carry it onward. In town, no one spoke as they watched the riders begin to leave, because whatever they had expected to witness had not happened the way they thought it would. There had been no demand, no claim, no taking, only a quiet arrival and an even quieter departure, leaving behind something no one could quite name, but all of them could feel. Ethan stood at the edge of his land, the repaired fence stretching out beside him, the saddle resting where it belonged, the tools scattered in the dust like pieces of a life that had been handed back to him without condition, and for a moment, he simply watched as the last of the riders crested the low rise at the far end of the valley, their figures growing smaller against the horizon until they became part of it once more. The wind moved through again, softer than before, carrying with it the faint echo of what had passed, and Ethan did not follow, did not call out, because there was nothing left to say that had not already been understood. He turned back toward his land, toward the work that would continue long after the dust had settled, And as he stepped forward, the weight he had carried the day before was no longer there in the same way. Not gone, not forgotten, but changed, shaped into something that no longer held him down. In his pocket, the turquoise rested where it had been placed, not as a payment, not as a reminder, but as something quieter, something that would stay with him not because it was given, but because of the moment it marked. And as the valley returned to its usual stillness, it became clear that what had happened here would not be spoken about in the same way as other things. It would not be measured or counted. It would simply remain in the land, in the silence, and in the understanding that sometimes the smallest choice a man makes when no one is watching can carry farther than any voice ever could. The valley returned to quiet the way it always had, slowly, without announcement, the dust settling back into the earth as if nothing had disturbed it. But anyone who had stood there that day knew the silence was not the same. It carried something now, something that lingered in the spaces between sounds, in the way the wind moved across the repaired fence, in the way the land seemed to hold its shape a little firmer than it had before. Ethan Cole worked until the light faded, not out of urgency, not because someone was watching, but because the rhythm had not left him yet. It stayed in his hands, in his shoulders, in the steady pace of breath that matched the work instead of fighting against it. And when he finally stopped, it was not because there was nothing left to do, but because the day itself had reached its end. He stood near the fence line, looking out over the stretch of land that had once felt like it was slipping through his fingers, and for a moment, he tried to find the exact place where everything had changed, the moment where giving up that horse had turned into something else entirely, something that could not be undone or returned to what it was before. But there was no single point he could name, no clear line where one thing ended and another began. It had happened the way the valley always changed, quietly, steadily, without asking for recognition. Behind him, the town had already begun to pull back into itself, people returning to their routines with a different kind of silence, not the kind that avoids, but the kind that considers. And among them, the man who had spoken the day before lingered a moment longer than the others, his eyes resting on Ethan not with judgment, not even with curiosity, but with something closer to understanding. The kind that comes too late to change what has already been said, but not too late to change what comes next. He did not call out, did not step forward. He simply nodded once, a small motion, and then turned away, carrying that moment with him in a way no one else could see. Ethan watched him go, not expecting anything, not needing anything, because what had passed between them did not require words to hold its meaning. The sky darkened slowly, colors fading into deeper tones as the last light slipped behind the low hills, and Ethan made his way back toward the house. Each step familiar, but lighter somehow, as if the ground beneath him no longer resisted in the same way. Inside, nothing had changed, and yet everything felt different. The same worn table, the same quiet corners, but the air carried something else. Something that did not come from the walls or the roof, but from what had been set into motion outside. He reached into his pocket and brought out the turquoise again, turning it in his hand under the fading light, tracing the worn edges with his thumb, and this time, he did not try to understand it, did not search for meaning beyond what had already been shown. He simply held it, the way a man holds something that does not belong to him alone, but to a moment he was part of. He set it down on the table without ceremony, not placing it carefully, not hiding it away, just leaving it where it could be seen, where it could remain part of the life he would continue to build. And then he stepped outside once more, the night air cooler now, carrying the distant sound of the valley settling into rest. The stars began to appear one by one, scattered across the sky in a way that made the land below seem smaller, quieter, and Ethan stood there for a long time without moving, without thinking about what might come tomorrow or the next day, because for the first time in a long while, he did not need to look that far ahead to know where he stood. Somewhere beyond the hills, riders would be making their way back to where they came from, carrying their own understanding of what had passed, just as the town carried theirs, just as Ethan carried his, and none of them would tell the story the same way, because it was not meant to be told in one voice or measured in one way. Out here, things like that do not belong to words. They belong to the land, to the quiet spaces where a man makes a choice without knowing who will see it and what the world might do with it after. The wind moved once more, soft, steady, passing through the fence, across the house, over the ground that now held a different kind of weight, and Ethan did not follow it, did not try to hold on to anything it carried. He simply stood where he was, knowing that whatever had been set into motion would continue long after this night, not because he had asked for it, but because he had chosen something when no one else was looking, and out here, that was the only kind of choice that ever truly mattered.